When you look at people who rarely post their photos on social media, especially empaths, you're not looking at a lack of confidence. And you're definitely not looking at a lack of identity. In many cases, you're looking at the exact opposite. You're looking at someone whose identity is not dependent on being seen, approved of, or mirrored back by others. That's a very different psychological foundation than what most digital environments are built on. Most people, whether they realize it or not, construct their sense of self through feedback loops. They post something, they receive engagement, and that engagement subtly tells them who they are, how they're perceived, and where they stand in the social hierarchy. Over time, this creates a kind of externalized identity, one that is shaped, edited, and sometimes even controlled by the reactions of other people. It becomes less about who am I and more about how am I being received. Empaths tend to disrupt that entire system. Their awareness is turned inward before it ever seeks outward confirmation. They're constantly processing their own emotions, questioning their motives, and observing their internal state with a level of depth that most people avoid. So when it comes to something like posting a photo, the question isn't, will people like this? It's, why am I doing this at all? And that question alone is enough to stop the behavior before it even begins. Because when your identity is internally anchored, external, validation starts to feel optional and sometimes even intrusive. There's also a philosophical layer to this. Empaths often recognize that a photograph is not a neutral act. It's a curated moment. It's a fragment of reality selected, filtered, and presented for interpretation. And they understand that once it's out there, it no longer belongs to them. It becomes subject to projection. People assign meaning to it, attach narratives to it, and respond not to the person but to the version of the person they've constructed in their own mind. For someone who values authenticity, that can feel deeply misaligned. So instead of participating in that cycle, many empaths choose to build a quieter, more stable sense of self. One that doesn't fluctuate based on engagement metrics. One that doesn't need to be reinforced by visibility. They invest in self-awareness, not self-display. And over time, that creates a kind of psychological independence that's rare in environments designed to keep people externally focused. Now, this doesn't mean they're disconnected or antisocial. In fact, it's often the opposite. Their connections tend to be more intentional, more present, and more grounded in reality rather than perception. But those connections don't require an audience. They don't need to be documented to be meaningful. And here's the part most people miss. When you stop relying on the outside world to tell you who you are, you gain a level of clarity that's difficult to manipulate. You're less reactive, less performative, less driven by comparison. You begin to operate from a place of choice rather than compulsion. That's not withdrawal, that's control. So when you see someone who chooses not to post their image, don't assume absence. Consider the possibility that they've simply stepped out of a system that most people never question. They've decided that their identity is something to be understood, not displayed. If you follow this pattern a little deeper, you start to see that it's not just about identity, it's about perception. Empaths don't simply understand that other people have opinions, they feel those opinions before they're even expressed. There's a kind of anticipatory awareness at play. They can almost predict the range of interpretations a single image might trigger, and more importantly, they can sense the emotional tone behind those interpretations. Now think about what that does to the decision to post a photo. For most people, a photo is a moment of expression. For an empath, it's a doorway. The second it's shared, it invites observation, judgment, comparison, admiration, criticism, all of it. And while others might brush those reactions off or selectively focus on the positive, empaths tend to absorb the full spectrum. They don't just see a comment, they feel the intention behind it. Even silence, no response at all, can register as a form of feedback. So the act of posting becomes psychologically heavier. There's also the issue of projection. People don't just look at an image, they project their own beliefs, insecurities, and assumptions onto it. One person sees confidence, another sees arrogance. One sees happiness, another sees performance. The same photo becomes a canvas for entirely different narratives, none of which the original person can fully control. Empaths are acutely aware of this dynamic. They understand that once an image is released into a social space, it stops being a reflection of them and starts becoming a reflection of everyone else. And for someone who values emotional accuracy, who wants to be understood, not misinterpreted, that can feel like a loss of control over their own identity. But it goes even further than that. Empaths are often highly sensitive to subtle shifts in social energy. They can detect when admiration carries a hint of envy, when curiosity masks judgment, when praise feels conditional. These aren't always obvious signals, but they're felt, and over time, repeatedly. Exposing themselves to that kind of mixed emotional input can become draining. So they make a calculation, often unconsciously. They weigh the benefit of sharing against the cost of absorbing, and more often than not, the cost wins. Not because they're afraid of judgment in the traditional sense, but because they experience judgment on a deeper, more immersive level than most people do. It's not about thin skin, it's about high sensitivity. And when you operate with that level of awareness, start to realize that not every door needs to be opened. Not every perspective needs to be invited in. There's a kind of discipline in choosing what you expose yourself to, especially when you know you're going to feel it more intensely than others. This is where many people misinterpret empaths. They assume avoidance. They assume insecurity. But what's really happening is selective engagement. It's a conscious or semi-conscious decision to limit unnecessary emotional input in an already overstimulated environment. Because here's the truth, when you're highly attuned to others, your environment isn't neutral, it's amplified. Every reaction carries weight. Every interpretation leaves an imprint. And if you don't manage that exposure, it starts to shape you in ways that aren't entirely your own. So choosing not to post isn't about hiding. It's about filtering. It's about recognizing that access to you, your image, your presence, your energy has value, and not everyone and not every moment has earned that access. If you continue along this line of thinking, the next layer isn't just about perception, it's about protection. For an empath, privacy isn't a preference in the casual sense. It functions more like a boundary system, a way of regulating how much of their internal world is exposed to external influence. And that's important because for someone who feels deeply, exposure isn't neutral, it has consequences. Most people think of privacy as withholding information. Empaths experience it as preserving energy. When an empath shares something personal, especially something visual like a photo, they're not just sharing an image. They're sharing context, mood, a snapshot of their emotional state at that moment in time. And whether others realize it or not, people respond to more than just what they see. There's an undercurrent to every image, a subtle emotional signal that others pick up on and react to, often unconsciously. Empaths know this, even if they can't always articulate it. So the decision to stay private becomes less about secrecy and more about containment. It's the understanding that once something is shared, it can't be unshared. It gets interpreted, stored, revisited, and sometimes even used as a reference point in ways that were never intended. And for someone who values emotional clarity and personal integrity, that kind of open-ended exposure can feel destabilizing. There's also a deeper psychological mechanism at work here. Empaths tend to have permeable boundaries by nature. They absorb emotional signals from their environment more readily than others. That's part of what makes them perceptive, intuitive, and often deeply compassionate. But it also means they have to be more deliberate about where they place themselves and what they allow in. Social media, by design, collapses boundaries. It invites constant access. It turns moments into content and experiences into shareable units. And while that might feel harmless on the surface, it creates an environment where the line between private and public becomes blurred. For someone with strong internal awareness, that blur isn't comfortable, it's chaotic. So they draw a line. They choose what remains internal and what, if anything, gets externalized. And in many cases, photos fall on the side of what stays private. Not because there's anything wrong with sharing, but because visual content carries a different kind of weight. It's immediate, it's personal, and it often reveals more than words ever could. Another piece that often goes unnoticed is the empath's relationship with vulnerability. Contrary to popular belief, empaths are not always eager to be openly vulnerable in public spaces. They value depth, yes, but depth requires safety. It requires trust. And those conditions don't exist in environments where attention is broad, fleeting, and often impersonal. So instead of distributing their vulnerability across a wide audience, they concentrate it. They share selectively with people who have demonstrated understanding, consistency, and respect. That creates a more stable emotional exchange, one that doesn't leave them feeling exposed or misunderstood. And this is where the distinction becomes important. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is often precision from the inside. It's a deliberate narrowing of access, not out of fear, but out of awareness. They're not avoiding connection, they're refining it. Because when you're someone who naturally feels more, the cost of unmanaged exposure is higher. It leads to emotional fatigue, confusion, and sometimes even a loss of self-definition. And over time, that's not sustainable. So privacy becomes a form of discipline, a way to maintain clarity in a world that constantly pulls for attention, a way to stay grounded in your own experience without being diluted by the noise of everyone else's reactions. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Not everything that can be shared should be shared, and not every part of you is meant for public consumption. As you start to see how identity, perception, and protection all connect, another layer begins to emerge, and it's one that's often misunderstood. It's the empath's relationship with attention itself. Not just receiving it, but participating in the act of drawing it in. Because for many empaths, posting photos doesn't feel like neutral sharing. It feels like a form of self-promotion, and that creates an internal conflict. Most social environments today reward visibility. The more you show, the more you're seen. And the more you're seen, the more you're validated. That's the loop. But empaths tend to question that loop at a deeper level. They're not just asking, will this get attention? They're asking, what does it mean that I want attention for this? And that question changes everything. Because once you start examining your motives, you begin to notice how much of modern communication is subtly performative. The angle of the photo, the timing of the post, the selection of what to reveal and what to leave out, it's all curated. It's all designed, consciously or not, to produce a certain impression. And for someone who values authenticity, that can feel like a misalignment between who they are and how they're presenting themselves. It's not that empaths reject attention entirely. They're human. They appreciate being seen and understood like anyone else. But there's a difference between being recognized for who you are and positioning yourself to be recognized. One feels organic, the other can feel engineered. And empaths are highly sensitive to that distinction. So when they consider posting a photo, there's often an internal check that happens. Am I sharing this because it's meaningful or because I want to be seen a certain way? If the answer leans toward image management rather than genuine expression, many will choose not to engage at all. This is where the discomfort with ego comes in. Not ego in the sense of arrogance, but ego as a constructed identity, something that's shaped and maintained through external feedback. Empaths tend to be wary of building a version of themselves that depends on constant reinforcement. They've already established through introspection that identity is fluid and deeply personal. Turning it into something that needs to be displayed and validated can feel like reducing it to a surface-level performance. There's also an awareness. That attention changes dynamics. The moment something becomes public, it introduces comparison. Not just from others, but within yourself. You start measuring how this post did versus the last one, how you appear versus how others appear. And even if you're not consciously competing, the environment itself is structured around comparison. Empaths often sense that shift early. They recognize how quickly something genuine can become transactional. How a moment that was once meaningful in itself becomes tied to its reception. And for someone who values depth, that transformation can feel like a loss of integrity. So instead of participating in that system, they step back from it. Not because they can't succeed in it, but because they're not interested in what it requires. They don't want to trade authenticity for visibility. They don't want to turn their life into a sequence of moments designed for display. And this creates a different kind of presence. One that isn't built on constant output, but on selective expression. When they do share something, it tends to carry more weight because it hasn't been diluted by repetition or driven by the need to maintain an image. It's intentional, not habitual. That's a very different approach to communication. And it's easy to overlook, especially in a culture that equates visibility with relevance. But there's a quiet strength in not needing to be seen all the time, in not feeling compelled to document your existence to prove that it's valid. Because at a certain point, you have to ask yourself, are you expressing who you are? Or are you maintaining a version of yourself that others expect to see? By this point, you can start to see a consistent pattern. This isn't avoidance, and it isn't disengagement. It's a shift in where value is placed. And nowhere is that more obvious than in how empaths approach connection itself. For many people, social media becomes a way to maintain a wide network of light interactions. A post goes out, people respond, and there's a sense of being connected to many at once. It's efficient, it's convenient, but it's also shallow by design. The interaction is brief, often reactive, and rarely requires presence. Empaths tend to operate differently. They're not just looking for interaction, they're looking for resonance. They want to feel understood, not just acknowledged, and that kind of connection doesn't scale well. It doesn't happen in comment sections or through passive engagement. It happens in focused one-on-one exchanges where attention isn't divided and the communication isn't filtered through performance. So when it comes to sharing something like a photo, they often ask a different question: who is this actually for? And if the answer is a broad, undefined audience, it starts to lose meaning. Because for them, meaning is tied to intention. It's tied to the quality of the exchange, not the quantity of responses. This is why many empaths will share parts of their life privately, but avoid doing so publicly. They might send a photo directly to someone they trust, someone who understands the context, someone who can receive it without projecting or distorting it. In that setting, the act of sharing feels complete. It lands where it's supposed to land. But when that same image is released into a wide, impersonal space, something changes. The connection becomes diluted. The responses become generalized. And instead of deepening a relationship, it often just maintains a surface-level presence. For someone who values depth, that trade-off doesn't feel worthwhile. There's also an element of presence that gets lost in broad sharing. When you're communicating with one person, you're there. Your attention is focused. You're engaged in real time. But when you broadcast something, your attention is scattered across multiple reactions, multiple interpretations, multiple timelines. It pulls you out of the moment and into a kind of distributed awareness. Empaths notice that shift. They feel the difference between being present with someone and being observed by many. And over time, they start to prefer the former, not because it's easier, but because it's real. It allows for nuance, for depth, for the kind of understanding that doesn't need to be explained, it's simply experienced. And this is where their behavior can be misread. From the outside, it might look like they're less connected, less involved, less visible. But in reality, connections are often stronger, more stable, and more meaningful. They've just chosen to invest their energy differently. Instead of spreading it thin across a wide audience, they concentrate it where it actually matters. Because connection for them isn't about being seen by many, it's about being known by a few. And that distinction changes how they show up in every environment. So the real question becomes this: are you trying to reach as many people as possible, or are you trying to truly connect with the right ones? Because those are two very different paths, and only one of them leads to something that actually lasts. Expand key point 6 into a 500-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Chase Hughes' approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. When you take everything we've talked about: identity, perception, protection, attention, and connection, it naturally leads to one final layer: awareness. Not just awareness of self, but awareness of the system itself. Empaths, more than most, tend to recognize that social media is not a neutral environment. It's engineered. It's designed to capture attention, amplify emotion, and keep you engaged for as long as possible. And that design has psychological consequences. Most people experience those effects without fully noticing them. The subtle comparison, the dopamine spikes from notifications, the quiet pressure to stay visible, to stay relevant, it becomes background noise, something you adapt to without questioning. But empaths are less likely to filter that noise out. They feel it, they track it, and over time they begin to see the pattern. They notice how quickly a moment shifts from being lived to being evaluated, how an experience becomes incomplete until it's shared, how attention starts to dictate behavior in ways that feel automatic rather than intentional. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to participate in it unconsciously. So many empaths make a decision, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once, to step back from certain aspects of that system. Not entirely, not in a rigid or absolute way, but selectively. They begin to ask, is this adding to my clarity or is it fragmenting it? And if the answer leans toward fragmentation, they reduce their exposure. Photos are often one of the first things to go because visual content tends to carry the highest impact. It invites immediate judgment, immediate comparison, immediate reaction. It pulls people into cycles of interpretation that are fast, repetitive, and rarely deep. And for someone who values mental and emotional clarity, that environment starts to feel noisy. There's also an understanding that constant exposure reshapes perception. The more you consume curated images of other people's lives, the more your internal standards begin to shift. Not always in obvious ways, but subtly what you consider normal, what you consider desirable, what you expect from yourself. Empaths are particularly sensitive to that kind of influence because they don't just observe it, they internalize it. So they become more intentional. They limit what they take in, and just as importantly, they limit what they put out. Not as a rejection of the world, but as a way of maintaining alignment with their own values. They want their thoughts to be their own, their emotions to be grounded in real experience, not shaped by a constant stream of external input. And this creates a different kind of relationship with visibility. They're not chasing it, and they're not avoiding it out of fear. They're choosing it on their terms, in ways that feel congruent rather than compulsive. That might mean sharing less, but it also means that what they do share is more deliberate, more accurate, and more reflective of who they actually are. Because at a certain level of awareness, you stop asking, how do I fit into this system? And you start asking, does this system fit into the life I'm trying to build? And that's a different level of control entirely. So maybe the real takeaway isn't about whether you post or don't post. It's about whether your behavior is driven by awareness or by default. Because the moment you start choosing your inputs and outputs consciously, you stop being shaped by the environment and you start shaping your experience within it.